That gives us a really clear understanding right now that what the two of you have described around sort of, if you like, the definition of what scope is all about, managing relevant priorities. But what's the role of a leader?
The question is from Thinking Focus.
Hello, I'm Rob from Thinking Focus.
Hi, I'm Ricky from Thinking Focus.
Hi, I'm Paul from Thinking Focus.
And the question is, to do or not to do? That is the question.
That's a very sneaky question, Rob. I like what you've done there.
That's brilliant.
I think one of the most frequent questions we get when training or coaching managers and leaders is, what is it leaders actually do? Give me a job description, just so I know I'm doing the right things. We did a lot of research around this and found lots of different opinions about different parts of a leader's role, but nothing that brought all of those aspects together in a way that succinctly answered the question we're being asked. So we built our own model, bringing together ideas of a disparate set of thought leaders on leadership. The model breaks down the role of a leader into three areas: purpose, people, and productivity. And with each of these areas, we've broken it down further into another 3 steps. In this podcast, we want to focus on the purpose section, and in particular, the role of leaders in developing the scope. That is what we do, and more importantly, where are the boundaries?
Okay, so that's almost answered the question, but I think we need to take that into a slightly further, or deeper, wider even definition. So what's this all about then? If we're thinking about developing the scope and leaders developing the scope, what's this all about? How might we define that?
Well, I think the first thing to think about is whenever we work with organizations, we have this big conversation about what you're going to do, what your key priorities, and what they rarely do is take stuff off the list. They add more to the list and still expect the other stuff to get done. So they keep adding, and their people get more and more confused, frustrated, because nobody's answering the question that says, so what do we really care about then?
Yeah, it's a really it's a challenging exercise for a leader, because you're trying to go, these are the things that we are prepared to do. This is the area we're prepared to work in. If you make it so tight, you constrain the people around you and what they can do. So you need to give people enough freedom to kind of try things and do things. If you make it too loose, then they're all over the place and trying to do too much, and they don't resource things properly. So it's kind of reining it in. I always think back to an example I had really early in my career where I worked for a service organization, big IT service organization, and we were selling to other companies. So we were their outsourced service arm. And we always used to joke that as IT ended up in more stuff, where was the boundary? And it was really clear from the director that we worked for that he used to just go, no white goods. So because originally it was we just did companies. Well, then computers were in the home. So do we do homes? Yeah, we do homes. Well, if we're doing homes and we do the monitor, why don't we do the TV? Because it's the same thing. So now we're doing TVs. Do you see what I mean? The scope kept creeping out. At what point do you go, that's not really what we're about?
Mm-hmm.
And it's really easy to go, well, what's the difference between a TV and a washing machine? I know you don't sit in front of the washing machine watching it for hours. Well, I hope you don't. But you get what I mean? Electronically now, these things are blurring. And I guess there's a lot of industries where that's true.
But I suppose probably the best or the kind of originator of this kind of thinking came from Michael Porter, who actually says strategy is choosing what not to do. It's not about choosing what to do. And that could be in terms of your proposition. You look at Southwest Airlines, who have basically got the leanest, meanest. They don't do anything with any extra bells and whistles because they know it devalues their core proposition, as an example. And that aligns to your, we now we'll do anything that's kind of watchable, but we draw the line at washing machines and fridges type thing. So you were really clear about what was in and out of scope within that. And I think that's where organizations kind of get really conflicted sometimes, particularly leaders who can't, and particularly if they've made promises around this in the past. You end up with this endowment effect. You end up with they get caught out by the sunk cost fallacy. Well, if we give up now, we've wasted all this time and money. And you go, well, actually, if we're betting now based on new information, a better horse, why would we not let go of that? But of course, we're scared to let go for fear of what that might look or feel like to others.
Yeah, we're worried we're not going to get the opportunity. And there are enough horror stories around where companies have kind of got their scope wrong. Because everybody, everyone talks about Kodak or Blockbuster and go, they missed an opportunity. Well, that's kind of a scope thing. Because if you think you're in, video rentals, why would you think about digital home entertainment? If you think you're in about, providing access to movies to everybody, maybe it would have been a bit more obvious to them what was going on. So it's a really challenging one because you're trying to pitch the scope as a leader somewhere between, it's a kind of a Goldilocks zone. It's not too hot, it's not too cold. It's got to be just right. And if you're getting it wrong, you're either, spreading your resources too thin and risking not achieving, or at the other end of the spectrum, going, look at that massive opportunity. It's kind of a bullseye moment. Look at what you could have won moment going on there.
Well, that's really interesting because when we work, and I'm sure, you guys are the same, when we work with organizations and you get them to go, right, what's on the list? And then you go, right, you can only have 5 things for Christmas. Which are they? And the agony they go through in trying to prioritize is just, it's painful to watch because they're like, yeah, but, and they can talk themselves back in and then they can talk themselves out and then back in again. And they go through this loop of things because, they're just desperate to achieve everything and they haven't faced up to the fact you can't have everything. You just can't unless you're gifted with a bottomless pit of money and resources. And even then you've got the right resources to do the right things at the right time, which is probably the perfect storm, and I don't think there's ever been one.
Even then, and that, you two know that from just running our own business. Even if we have the resources, even if we had the money and we could find people to do it, it still takes leadership time and effort. It still takes time and attention. You've got to think about stuff. You've got to give the people the time they need to do it. And if you're doing too much, then you wear yourself too thin and you become the glass ceiling for your own purpose.
And it's interesting because the last 2 things that you both mentioned brought in the element of time on that. So that prioritization piece, the why this, if it is coupled with the and why now, actually helps that scope to be very, very clearly defined. Because going back to your description, Ricky, about, 5 things that you want for Christmas, it might be that you got 14 things on your list and you agonize over those things, but it might be these 5 things are for this Christmas. You've got another 4 or 5 things that are on the list for next Christmas. So, it helps to bring in the why are we doing this and why now? What's the importance around this to make it meaningful and relevant?
That's really interesting because a lot of time when we're working with people, when you say to somebody, take something off the list, it's they act like you're asking them to put it in the bin.
Yes.
Not stick it in the cupboard for later.
Absolutely. Yeah. Park that for the moment because here's the very strategic decision about the because piece. So, this causes us then to think about, so what's the role of a leader in this? That gives us a really clear understanding right now that what the 2 of you have described around sort of, if you like, the definition of what scope is all about, managing relevant priorities. But what's the role of a leader in this?
It's kind of 2 sides to that coin for me. One is creating the story or the narrative that helps everybody else kind of understand where the boundaries are.
Okay.
And that might sound a bit weird, but I guess, we don't know boundaries until we hit them. And so as a leader, somehow you're going to have to explain where the boundaries are, even though people have never seen them and they might not know they're there. Mm-hmm. So that when they get there on their own, they kind of get that they're there, which is harder than you think. It's quite tough to just explain what I just said, let alone do it.
With regards to boundaries, how do people know when to stop? So you set them on a track, and without the boundaries, they keep going and keep going, and actually all of a sudden you've just wasted time, effort and resource that you didn't intend to or mean to because there aren't those boundaries, there aren't those constraints built in that says at this point please stop.
Yeah, and I think, for me, that's sort of going back to that no white goods sort of story. It was always said with a joke, but it helped me and a load of other people who did the work I did looking for customers to look at an organization and go, am I stepping too far? And at least you kind of ended up in a position where you knew, well, I'm safe with this one. I'm definitely not safe with that one. And there's a chunk in the middle I'm not sure about. But at least then I knew as the salesperson to go, before I go too far with this one, I need to go and have a conversation with somebody because I'm in a grey area.
So that to me means that it helps the group to understand how things outside of the scope can destroy value or compromise what the group can achieve. it really, a role of a leader is to help to do that as well.
Yes, because that's how you maintain focus.
Yeah, and I think, but your example earlier, Paul, about we do monitors and then TVs and things. That's about making a judgment at the right time about whether to broaden that scope. And you kind of got some adjacency there, some common themes. Whereas actually to move from TVs and monitors, as your example, to white goods, actually probably required a different viewpoint, different set of skills, a different level of understanding, and actually was probably a leap too far. Whereas moving from your monitor to TVs actually was fairly straightforward. Fundamentally the same thing, just wrapped up in a different case type of thing.
And it comes to the perspective, because if you look at it through the skill of the engineer, it probably was completely different. If you looked at it through the process, getting a skilled person in a van to a house at the right time, working out what spare you needed, getting the spare there, it's identical. So again, it's kind of understanding what's our purpose here, what's in for us. Is our purpose to service stuff in people's homes and keep it going, or is it IT in that example? Because depending on which one you picked, you will come up with a completely different set of boundaries.
And I think that's why purpose is so important, because it helps your decision making.
Yeah.
In terms of your scope, does that achieve that end game? Is that going to help us to achieve that end game? And if the answer is no, we don't do it. It doesn't get added.
And I think therefore, for me, that the scope is one of the most challenging parts of the purpose piece, because once you've got your higher purpose, if you've done the work reasonably well, it's going to move, but it's not going to move radically. The reality is we're trying to achieve this ripple in the universe, and you're probably going to head there in some shape or form over a really long period of time. But scope has to move over time. As you achieve things and get better at things, you need to achieve more and do more. And so the leader's job is not only to constantly keep moving those boundaries and working out what the scope looks like for us now, which of those things that we've stuck in the cupboard need to come out and get resourced now. But it also is partly to go, how do you then get the followers, the people involved in this project, to understand why the boundaries are moving in a way that makes sense to them? Because as a leader, you're being the judge on these edge cases, but why have we gone that way and not that way?
Right.
And that takes some courage to make that judgment, as opposed to, we'll let it through on this occasion, and before you know it, you've just broadened your scope unwittingly.
Because if you are too scared about letting anything go, you're worried about potential opportunities you might miss, you are just going to eventually run out of resources. You're going to, or worse, actually, you don't run out of resources. You just try and run them all too thin. So there's not enough focus on the things you want to do. So you're moving forward, but you're not really moving forward successfully, and you're not executing on what you really want. On the other hand, if you go too small and too tight, that's quite hard on your followers. You're not giving them any scope or any ability for them to show their creative spark and for them to try things and do things. So you've got to find somewhere that gives people enough room to breathe and move and do stuff, but not necessarily overstretch them and take your organization or your purpose off into directions you never intended.
Right.
I think that also has some implications for your people too, because if you kind of narrow it down, they might not feel developed, opportunities to grow. They might not feel kind of stretched. We talk about the, getting that Goldilocks effect in terms of how you motivate and stimulate your people, as opposed to burning them out or leaving them, with too little to do. The same is true also if you overstretch them. You will burn them out. If you start to spread them too thinly, where do they focus? What do they focus on? Do they do the job right, or do they kind of cut corners and do everything okay? And the question is then okay going to be good enough for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting you say that, because one of the sort of definitions of demand of burnout is where demand outstrips resources, and the people most likely to do that are people who believe in the purpose. If they're desperately trying to achieve this purpose, and yet what we're asking them to do is just way beyond the time, the resources, the skills, the whatever that we have to give them to do it, there are people out there who will kill themselves in the process. And so, to keep people at that right level, we're trying to go, how do we make this as wide as we possibly can without killing the people and the resources that we've got? How can we do as much as possible within the constraints of what we can actually achieve?
And I guess an ultimate example of that, not that it's a named company, is where we've got examples of companies where they flip-flop between the two. So for a number of years, it's sort of like we've got to work on, a really sort of limited scope, and then a market opens up or they do particularly well, and then make the mistake of going too wide and have to constrict again 3 years later. That flip-flopping it must be, just the death or seeming like the death to the followers in the group.
Yeah, and I suppose, we've seen some examples recently, haven't we, where organisations recognise that they don't want to be Blockbuster and a dinosaur and disappear, so they're trying to flip their model. But what they can't do is turn off the old model until the new model is ready. So actually, they become really conflicted with, well, I thought we were this, and I thought we were that, and I thought we were trying to get here, and I thought... And all of a sudden you've got conflict in terms of understanding, which comes back to, let's be clear, what we're working towards, why we're working towards that end game. And actually within the journey, there's going to be some of you in the future, some of you are going to be keeping the engine ticking over while we're building that future. And some of you are going to flip-flop between both.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting because what you're saying there is actually saying different parts of this group now may have different scopes towards this purpose.
But to the higher purpose, their part in that is equally valid and equally important.
And potentially gets confusing, doesn't it? Because you sort of go, I've got this connection with that higher purpose, and what I'm hearing from the sort of changes or shifts in scope confuses me about whether or not we've lost sight of that higher purpose.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to the skill of the leader then, being able to make all that make sense and realign people back to that purpose of going, well, the reason we're now including this, the reason we're allowing ourselves to do something slightly differently, whether that be geographically or product-wise or in terms of our revenue model, it doesn't really matter. The reason we've changed our mind on this is this, and this is how it aligns to where we're going, and this is how it all fits together. Because if the leader can make it all make sense, people will follow it and they will quite happily accept it. But if it seems like either the leader is missing scope, either restraining us too much, or is adding stuff on that doesn't really feel like it's going where we're going, that's when you have that leadership problem of people struggling to follow.
Yeah. And actually opting out, perhaps, completely opting out by leaving, or opting out of particular things that are really quite critical to the group or to the organisation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's for me is you go. There's sort of one level of opting out, which is they leave the organisation, and then there's the worst level, which is actually they stay.
Yes, and opt out. Yeah, very true. So let's leave this with a couple of tips then. I don't know if we've got a couple of tips that we can share around, keeping to scope or making scope work well for us.
Not necessarily a tip, but it's a model that I've found useful in the past, which is coming from Moore's Crossing the Chasm stuff, which is pretty old now, but it's quite good. And he talks about the concept of, and he was really talking about products, but I think it fits this example here of thinking about things like a bowling alley, so 10 pins. And if you do it right, what you're doing is aiming at one pin. So you're aiming at quite a narrow scope with the view of whichever way that pin falls tells you what comes next, tells you how to widen the scope. So it might be, look, we're going to throw the ball and aim at this front pin. If it knocks the pins to the left down, that means we're taking this idea into different territories. If it knocks the pins to the right down, it means we're doing other versions of this idea.
Right.
And being quite happy to move the scope and change the scope over time, not based on what you originally thought, but based on what happened when you knocked the first thing down.
And I suppose that's quite a skillful art from a leader standpoint, because people like certainty, people like clarity, and actually to say, we're going to go so far, then we're going to stop and learn, and then we're going to make some decisions based on evidence, data, and what we've learned from what we've just done in order to determine the next one. That can be uncomfortable for people, can't it? That ambiguous kind of, they go, we don't know what you're doing type approach is actually, we're just being agile.
And I would say, particularly here in the UK, we've kind of got this myth that goes around that, and it really stems from political leadership as opposed to company leadership. But this idea that leaders shouldn't change their minds, which I find perplexing. That actually leaders really should change their mind. They should be open to what's gone on and go, right, we've learned something new. Let's reassess this. Now we're going that way. But we seem to see that as a leadership weakness for some obscure reason, particularly in our media.
And I wonder if that perception is based around the difference between exactly what we're talking about, scope and higher purpose, because it may be, and I would argue that most of the times leaders are not changing their mind about the higher purpose. They're actually changing their mind about the scope to reach that higher purpose for very good business reasons.
And I think that leads into probably the tip to kind of finish this on, which is about using that higher purpose to help with your decision making. Is this helping us to get to that point? Is what we're doing or choosing to do going to serve that end game? And if it's not, then actually it's just a distraction. And it's worse than that. It is actively working against you achieving what you really want, because you're diverting resource, you're diverting money, time, effort, all of that, and perhaps confusing your people in the way. So use your use your purpose as almost your kind of driving compass when you're making decisions. Does it fit?
Next time on The Question Is.
Hi, I'm Paul from Thinking Focus, and I'm just tagging on the end of this podcast to let you know where you can find more about the leadership model we've been talking about today. If you'd like to know more, maybe see the model in its entirety, or download some free coaching resources to help you think about your leadership style, and then go to www.thinkingfocus.com/what-is-leadership. That's thinkingfocus, all one word, .com/what-is-leadership.
To find out how Thinking Focus can unlock the potential within your organisation, go to www.thinkingfocus.com, where you'll discover more about the work we do, helping our clients increase productivity and enable change.